Hello, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Julie Lafford, Executive Director of Alumni Engagement at York University. And I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you in the audience, whether this is your first Scholars Hub at home with us or if you've joined us before. Thanks and welcome to this week's event. This webinar is part of our Scholars Hub speaker series and features timely and relevant educational lectures by academics from York. We're very pleased to be able to bring this series online to allow even more alumni to hear from some of the university's leading scholars. Before we begin, I want to give a brief update about York. York has joined all other GTA universities and many large organizations in supporting the City of Toronto's request to continue remote work until fall 2020, excuse me. The university is beginning to plan for a gradual and phased return to our campuses for the fall and winter semesters to ensure the safety of our students, faculty, and staff. If you'd like to stay informed as we share plans for returning to our campuses, a link to a dedicated Return to Campus website should appear on your screen now. I also want to tell you about a very engaging and very relevant discussion in last week's special edition of Scholars Hub at Home. The lecture was titled Reflection, Engagement, and Action Against Anti-Black Racism in Ontario, Part 2. If you haven't watched it already, please do so. I highly recommend it. You can find it on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/York Alumni. Although we aren't all in the same location, we do recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Now I'd like to take a quick poll asking, have you ever attended a York event other than this one right now? It should pop up on your screen very shortly, and I'll give everyone a moment to respond. Great. Thanks everyone for participating in that poll. I see that 61% of you have attended before. Welcome back. And 39% haven't joined us before. Thank you for being here. And I think you're going to find this lecture very engaging. If any of you need help with the Zoom platform at any time, feel free to click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and enter your question. Our team is ready to help you. That same button can be used to submit questions for our speaker during the Q&A period following the talk. And for those of you watching live on Facebook, feel free to submit any questions or comments through the comment section for this video, and the team will send them my way. Today's talk is titled COVID-19 and the Impact on the Lives of People Experiencing Homelessness. What are the implications? Featuring Stephen Gaetz, professor in the Faculty of Education, President of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and Scientific Director of Making the Shift, which is the Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab. Dr. Gaetz is a leading scholar on homelessness. He focuses his efforts on working in collaboration with partners to conduct research that will guide and inform solutions to homelessness. Dr. Gaetz has played a leading international role in knowledge mobilization and homelessness research through the Homeless Hub. In 2017, he was named a member of the Order of Canada, and his works have been published in leading academic journals, and he sat on numerous boards throughout his career. Welcome, Dr. Gaetz. It's such a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm going to turn the floor over to you now because everybody's here to hear from you. So take it away.
Okay. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm looking forward to sharing this information with you, but also getting your questions and comments back. This is a trying time for everyone. And so to have conversations about COVID-19 in a context where most people have a lot of knowledge about the situation is going to be quite interesting, because the question here to ask is, when we have a pandemic, how does it impact on subpopulations differently? And also, how do our responses to pandemics impact on different groups of people, right? Because as we'll see, there are underlying assumptions in how we create systems responses to anything. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint now. And so we'll go from there. So we'll be looking at this issue then, COVID-19 and homelessness. What are the implications? And what I want to do to start with is begin by the context where we have created this thing called modern mass homelessness. Homelessness is one of those, what we call seemingly intractable problems where people go, well, there's always been homelessness. There always will be. What can you do? And the actual reality is more complicated than that. While there have been people who have been homeless throughout history and in many, but not necessarily all countries, the problem really exploded in Canada in the 1980s and 1990s, about a decade after it did in the United States. So I'll just start by giving you a sense of the scale of it. So like in a given year, there are about 235,000 people experience homelessness in a way where they touch a public system about it. That's an undercount then, because lots of people experience homelessness and never go to shelters or day programs, that kind of thing. About 5,000 are unsheltered, meaning they don't go to emergency shelters or have any place to stay, but they'll sleep outside or in tents, that kind of thing. Another 180,000 are staying in emergency shelters, and 50,000 are provisionally accommodated. That's people who would be homeless, but who are in prison or in hospital, neither of which we would consider being housed. But they're still homeless. If upon discharge they have nowhere to go, then we still can consider them homeless. Okay. On any given night, that means about 35,000 Canadians are homeless in these different situations. And so when I talk about the creation of modern mass homelessness, this is a policy and investment driven trend that we can see is an outcome of a lot of neoliberal policy shifts in the 90s. And I'll explain what I mean by that after, because I always hate it when people say a neoliberal response to something, and I'm like, what do you mean by that? So we'll get at that after. And so we saw, like with globalization of trade and other economic changes, that the Canadian economy deindustrialized. And so we've seen a transition where, wealth, we're seeing greater disparities in wealth, right? Which makes people more vulnerable. We've also, with this rise in neoliberalism, we saw in government this idea that government should do less and that the private sector can do things more efficiently. And so, we had cuts to welfare in Ontario in 1995. Those still, we've never caught up, and even under many years of Liberal Party control, they never brought back the compensation levels to what they were back then at all. In fact, this table on the right can show us from a study by John Stapleton that looks at, like, if you adjust, held the rate of payment in 1995 constant, what would it mean for people? But the biggest example of a neoliberal shift is around affordable housing. What you need to know is that up until the 1980s, the government of Canada, starting in the post-Second World War period, invested in the building of around 18,000 units of affordable housing annually. So this is public housing, as well as co-ops, these kinds of things. So direct investment in making housing that's affordable. And so the shift came with this gamble, right? That the federal government said, you know what? The private sector can probably do a better job of addressing the housing needs of Canadians than us building this kind of housing. So there was a dramatic decline in federal spending on housing in the early 1990s. And then they did things like change the way they transfer funds to the provinces and that kind of thing. And an increase in tax expenditures and subsidies for home ownership, so that people like me could borrow from my RSPs with no tax penalty to pay for a down payment, things like that, right? So incentivize individuals and the private sector to create housing, right? This is the idea. And so that led to a steady decline in spending over the years. Now, that it didn't go to zero doesn't reflect what I said before that they were getting out of it. It's that they were committed because of long-term funding arrangements with the existing housing stock. They're committed to investing in those over time. But in terms of new builds, it went down very low, almost to nothing, from 18,000 a year. Now consider, since 1990, the Canadian population has also increased by 30%. So you have this huge gap that we've created in affordable housing. And in terms of what got built, now this is a table from 1990 to 2010. If you look at the 1990, you can see that the kind of housing that was built by the private sector was a combination of freehold housing, suburban houses, condominiums, and rental. But as you see through time, the building of rental accommodation shrunk and shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. We have seen a rebound in the last 5 years, but that still created a problem, right? So rising population, lack of direct investment in affordable housing, plus the private sector not building it. Like, why would they, right? They're there to make profit. We've also seen other things that have created challenges around affordable housing. So short-term rentals, Airbnbs, from this statement here, 31 Canadian housing units are, there's 140,000 Airbnb listings in Canada, 31,000 Canadian housing units rented frequently enough that they're likely to be used as permanent resident. That's like a big sucking sound out of our housing sector, right? And then there's another thing that happened, right? In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, which we all remember, with the banks in the US collapsing, that didn't happen so much in Canada. But what happens in these times, and it's happening right now during the pandemic, people think the economy is collapsing, but there's actually a lot of liquidity. There's a lot of capital out there. And so what happened after 2008 is these funds started buying up housing, right, as an investment, right? Housing prices in the US collapsed, so in swoop these investment funds to buy up housing. And in many cases, they keep it off the market because they're not necessarily interested in being property managers. They're buying it as an asset. And that led to inflation in housing, which is what their goal was, right? What they didn't want is to create housing or own housing. They wanted a return on their investment. And so by pulling things out of the market, it led to an increase in value. And this is something we have to be very careful of right now in this pandemic, because there is a lot of capital out there, and interest rates are very low. And so we could see a further erosion. So all of this meant basically something that everybody on this webinar knows, that affordable housing is unachievable for many Canadians. And rents are high. The cost of housing, if you want to purchase it, is really high. It's higher in some places than others, but there's no places where it's like a bargain, right? And so that automatically puts all kinds of people who have other things going on in their lives at risk. So this is a structural problem that we created, right? And it also suggests that neoliberal experiment that suggested the private sector would get us out of the problem of housing was an absolute failure, a policy failure that we're still recovering from. And all of this, so this led to a rise in homelessness. And when I moved to Toronto in the 80s, you could see the difference by 1995. Homelessness was much more present, visible, that kind of thing. And so in response to that rise in homelessness, this is what we've had in Canada. Now, there are three things you can do to address homelessness. One, you can focus on prevention, so stop the inflow. The second is emergency services like shelters, day programs, that kind of thing. And then finally, you can move people out of homelessness into housing with the supports that they need based on what they need. Now, throughout the last several decades, the bulk of our energy until recently has been on that middle part, the emergency response. And I would argue it still largely is in Canada. That's where the action is. And it's funny to call it an emergency response because we liken it to like a pandemic or a town catches on fire. Just keeping track of the time here. But when somebody's chronically homeless in emergency shelters for 20 years, I fail to see response to homelessness is like being an emergency department in a hospital, right? We have to triage those who are most vulnerable and meet their needs, and everyone else has to wait. And I think that's a ridiculous metaphor because can you imagine building your healthcare system around only the emergency room, right? If that's all we had. So I've got like a minor ailment, I have to go to emerge. We would never do that. And that's what we've done with homelessness. It's also very expensive. There's a study done by Eric Latimer in Montreal of 5 Canadian cities. And the cost of keeping someone in a state of homelessness for a year in Toronto is over $59,000. That's the cost of shelters and services and supports. It's the cost of increased health expenses because your health declines dramatically when you're homeless. And it's the cost of involvement of the criminal justice system because we have to also note that we use policing as a response to homelessness, right? We have the Safe Streets Act and we use ticketing and we incarcerate people regularly. And when you layer on the existence of systemic racism in Canada, it won't be surprising, but many people who are homeless, who are Indigenous or Black, are more likely to wind up in these situations. So where are we at now? So in Canada, things began to shift under Stephen Harper in a positive way, where they kind of pivoted towards housing first, which is an intervention to get people out of homelessness. And then the new, well, it's not new now, but Government of Canada has now done a couple of things that are good. One is a national housing strategy with a large scale investment in housing over 10 years. But bear in mind, when you have a 30-year gap in affordable housing strategy and a 30% growth in population, you're in a very deep hole. The Government of Canada also instituted its homelessness strategy in 2017 called Reaching Home. And it's a very interesting strategy. And one of the things that I think is most positive about it is if you look at the outcomes areas, they're talking about the last two are focused on prevention. And in North America, prevention is the prevention of homelessness is seen as almost a dirty word. It's like, we'll get to prevention once we've housed all the chronically homeless people first. And so, this is a positive sign. They're doing some interesting things. Okay. So, and then they declared housing as a human right. It's not as robust as it needs to be, but we will hopefully get there. So that's the setup. And you need to understand that to understand why our current response puts people in jeopardy. So when we think about pandemics and homelessness, there are certain things we need to consider. When we rely on that emergency response, day programs, emergency shelters that kick people out during the day, what does that mean for people who are homeless during a pandemic? And so we did some research during the H1N1 pandemic and came away with these kind of thoughts on it. The first consideration is that being homeless means you're vulnerable to the spread of infectious disease and that your health is made more vulnerable. We have tons of research that shows that prolonged exposure to homelessness has a very negative impact on health, mental health, and well-being for many people who are homeless. Stephen Wong has done research in the past that suggests, he's at the University of Toronto, that suggests that if someone's been homeless for any length of time, their body and their health is, like a person 15 years older, right? So there's big significant declines in exposure to infectious disease. Part of the challenge around exposure to infectious diseases is that the way we respond to homelessness produces vulnerability, right? So there are lots of differences in emergency shelters across Canada, so we have to be careful not to generalize, but many of them have, people are living in the same room, that people don't necessarily have private rooms. They're often on cots side by side. The distance between the cots is often not there. They'll be in rooms with people who are sick, and that kind of thing. And so this isn't the fault of the service providers, nor is it the fault of people who are homeless, but it makes people very vulnerable. The other thing I mentioned is people get kicked out during the day. So, so that's important. The third thing is that different subpopulations may be particularly vulnerable during a pandemic. So I mentioned Indigenous people. They make up 4.5% of the Canadian population, but 30% of the homeless population, and are overrepresented in prison and child protection as well. And so our history of colonialism and ongoing racism impacts on people who are Indigenous and impacts on their ability to get services and supports where they need them. Many Indigenous people won't say at a shelter or a program that they're Indigenous because there's no advantage, right? And likewise with Black racism, right? Like people may avoid accessing services because of discrimination, and may be unable to because of the systemic barriers in accessing services and supports they need. And we know through this pandemic that people who are Black, because of systemic racism, are more vulnerable to COVID-19. So we need to be reminded of these things. Here's a key thing that's really interesting. What are the underlying assumptions of pandemic responses that can lead to actions that may not apply to homeless populations? The first assumption is that everybody has a home and access to clean water, right? So this is from the H1N1 Public Health Agency of Canada thing. And so if you look at like, what are the directives for people, right? Wash your hands often and thoroughly in warm soapy water, or use hand sanitizer. I have hot soapy water at my house and hand sanitizer, so I'm okay. But like, that's a big assumption to make for someone who's homeless. Cough and sneeze in your arm, not your hand, that might be fine, but you may not have clean clothes every day, that kind of thing. Keep common surfaces and items clean and disinfected. Now, how are you going to do that? Whether you're in a shelter or sleeping under a bridge, it's not possible. And then stay at home if you're sick. What? Like, what's home? Stay at the shelter. Contact a healthcare provider if your symptoms worsen. Many people won't have access to healthcare providers, even in our Canadian system, right? People may lack health cards and things like that, or because of systemic racism, don't have equal access to support. So we have to be very careful with our response, right? Especially when we have mandatory lockdown. Like, think about that. If you're living under a bridge or in a park, what does it mean? If you're living in a shelter and you want to get out during the day because it's impossible to keep social distance in a shelter, and you go outside to a park and get a ticket, does that make sense, right? And that's a key thing, right? Like, when we start ticketing people for being in parks and public spaces, how are we thinking about the fact that people who are homeless are forced to be in public spaces? And I have to tell you, if I was homeless now, I would choose to be in a public space instead of being in a shelter, right? Fifth consideration, important questions about system capacity in the homeless sector. These organizations aren't rolling in dough. So like, what can they do in the context of a pandemic to plan and implement response to the pandemic? And what we're going to see is that the sector has it's quite interesting in Canada. Lots of innovation and lots of really good things going on. And I'll talk about Toronto. Sixth consideration is that pandemics and our response to them are highly unpredictable. And so when you have a situation that makes predictability even more complicated, it's very difficult. So for instance, people experiencing homelessness may move between shelters and day programs for reasons that are up to them, right? And they're allowed to, right? Like, it's not jail. can we predict how what happens when H1 or the coronavirus enters the shelter system? What happens when lockdowns are lifted? These kinds of things. The seventh consideration is around ethics, and thankfully, for the most part, we haven't seen this. In disasters, human rights are often compromised. Janet Mosher at Osgood Hall said this once, and I love this quote, so I'm going to try and get it right. But she said, in times of crisis, people are willing to exchange human rights for what they consider safety, typically as long as it's somebody else's rights, right? And so in a pandemic, like what would happen if we said people who are homeless have to go into shelters? That kind of, and we started forcing people to do things that we wouldn't do for other people, to other people. So there we are. Let's now look at the Canadian response and how it's impacted on people who are homeless. And so there are a number of things that, some of which apply to all Canadians that are helpful. So income supports, the CERB program, the challenge will be that many, is facilitating people experiencing homeless getting access to that. Many won't have a SIM card or have lost it or ID or any kind of connection with CRA, that kind of thing. There's been an increased federal investment in supports for emergency services for the homelessness sector, and the government has altered a lot of its directives, and I'll show you in a second, to kind of support that. Things like moratoriums on evictions that have happened in Canada. So these kind of things are important examples of some of the things that was done. So this is from the federal government directives, which are, government directives are the documents that basically speak to what is allowable spending for people who receive federal funds. And so they've been working very well, I think, to try and do this kind of work. There've been national organizations like the Canadian Alliance who's been working with the service providers to try to build up and share ideas and this kind of thing. Away Home Canada, which is a national coalition that works with young people who are homeless, has been doing that work with youth homelessness, and the observatory as well. At the community level, one of the things we've seen is a lot of innovation, right? So like, during H1N1, there was some degree of planning, but that pandemic wasn't nearly as severe as this one. And so communities have risen to the challenge in all kinds of ways. At the same time, they're facing all kinds of problems and uncertainty. So many communities have started to house people, to clear out their shelters by getting people into housing, which kind of begs the question, why can't we do that in non-pandemic period? Many people are moved into hotels, that kind of thing. And so, and we've reconfigured shelters and that kind of thing. So I'm going to talk about, so here's a list of some of the things. One of the things at the bottom I think is really interesting. So the City of Toronto, and I confirmed this with city staff, about a month ago announced it was going to build 1,000 units of permanent supportive housing using modular housing within 1 year. And that's like unheard of, right? Because of the length of time it takes for approvals and all of these kind of things. And so that ability to pivot and innovate and do things that you couldn't do during a non-pandemic time tell us a lot about how we could move forward, right? So people are getting things done. It's very, very exciting. And I'm going to talk about City of Toronto response because I don't know, where people on the webinar are from, but many people will be living in Toronto, given this is a York alumni event. Toronto has done what I would say a really good job and been very innovative and creative in their response to homelessness during the pandemic. So just so you know, Toronto has the largest homeless population of any city in Canada, far and away. Like the next one is much less. It has a largest shelter system with 75 shelter and respite sites, accommodating about 7,000 people a night. Then there's, I can't give you the figure. I'm guessing probably under 1,000 people who are sleeping outside of shelters, that kind of thing. So the city has worked really well. And this was a lesson out of H1N1, is that we need strong intergovernmental collaboration. working well with the sector, working well with different public institutions like the healthcare system and the community not-for-profit sector. And so here are some of the highlights of some of the things they've been doing, right? So that picture I showed you where the cots are side by side by side. If we're going to expect that people social distance, we have to rethink the emergency shelter system. And so the city's done a massive transformation of that. They've opened 33 new temporary facilities, and in the existing shelter system created a system whereby the cots are 2 meters apart if they're in the same room, right? It's still, you have to manage the social distancing because people are going to be walking around, that kind of thing. So that's pretty good. They were able to do that by adding the new temporary facilities, but also by doing a whole bunch of things to get people out of the shelter system. And this is really exciting. So, 14 or 1,500 people were moved out of shelters into hotel sites, 16 hotel sites. That's amazing. New spaces are created in community centers and other places, right? 550 spaces. So people moving out of the shelter system. People in encampments, so people sleeping rough have moved into housing and apartments. And about 1,000 people have been housed, 1,000 in a 3-month period. Like, this is amazing. Again, like, if we can do it now, why can't we keep going? So that's really good. They've also done a lot of work on mitigation, right? So how can we do screening more effectively given the vulnerability of people who are homeless? How can we do that? What kind of, how do we isolate people who now are infected? And what do we do to help people recover post infection, that kind of thing. And one of the interesting things is the predicted levels of infection and hospitalization that were anticipated in the homelessness sector have not, at this point anyway, been as severe as what people anticipated. So that's good news, and could be, frankly, could be due to the mitigation efforts that the city has engaged in. So what happens next? I'm going to go through this and then we'll open it up to questions. So when the recovery happens, and recovery can happen in stages, right? Like, it might be this fall, but it might be a year or two from now, right? But there's lots of things that could have a big impact on the world of homelessness, things that won't be helpful. If there's a premature cut in CERB, right? If they cut it too soon, so you have still high levels of unemployment and will for a while, and people are going to be, then you're making people vulnerable because they won't have enough money. Rise in evictions could happen. We could have austerity and cutbacks. Stephen Harper's already working with Jason Kenney and others to put austerity back on the agenda, as are the two leading leadership candidates for the Conservative Party. We could see the expansion of the financialization of the housing market, right? All that capital going into scooping up housing. We could see a return to usual in the homelessness sector. And we could see unintentionally a dramatic rise in homelessness during the recovery, right? So we need to think about that. I'm showing you here a chart from a researcher at Washington University in St. Louis, Patrick Fowler, who does a lot of modeling. And one of the things he picked up on is that during holiday periods, evictions drop, right? So landlords will, in December, say, well, it's a bad time of year to evict someone right before the holidays. But what happens is what he calls the slingshot effect. You see a massive spike. And so one of the things to consider in the next phase is, if the moratoriums on evictions end, are we going to see a massive, massive increase in evictions? The province of Ontario has been toying with the idea of making it easier to evict people, so that could complicate things even further. So these are the kind of things we've got to be thinking about going forward, and how we're going to move forward in a way that's not going to lead to not just a return to normal in homelessness, but a massive increase. But there are opportunities. COVID-19, I think, highlights the folly of warehousing people who are living in extreme poverty. That it might be well-meaning, but I think it's wrong, right? And we can do things differently. We've also seen the government response at all levels open up to unconventional thinking and testing new ideas. So can we ride that wave and continue that? And also the planning for recovery is happening. So here are some ideas, and some of these are in a campaign by the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, but these are ones that we at the Observatory think are really good possibilities. During the recovery period, when there's going to be high unemployment, what about fast tracking investment in building more affordable housing? Like really front load that 10-year investment so that we get some more affordable housing built quickly. And looking at Toronto's example of the permanent supportive housing in 1 year, let's go. The CERB benefit, there's, in Ontario, there was that experiment with guaranteed basic income. There's more talk about that now than ever. And Spain's going in that direction. And that would be a bold kind of thing government could do that would be very interesting. And again, in the context of the pandemic, you can do really cool things. Government could invest in an evictions prevention strategy and expand the Canada housing benefit, right? So what's interesting is that we actually have a public record of who, for legal evictions, like who has had an eviction notice filed against them. And so why couldn't we go in and do early intervention and resolve the issue to the benefit of the tenant, but also landlords? There's great examples of how to do evictions prevention in the United States, and we've never taken it to scale in Canada. We do it in bits and pieces. City of Toronto has some programming on that, but like, what if we went to scale and said, we're going to just like really help people? We could implement measures to curtail the financialization of the housing market by taxing that, right? Nobody's going to be crying if we start taxing that kind of thing. But also like give first right of refusal to public housing organizations, not-profit housing organizations, et cetera, when housing comes on the market, right? Before it can go to that source. Aggressively address housing precarity and homelessness amongst Indigenous peoples. This is like, we got to start putting our money where our mouth is, right? Like we've been talking about truth and reconciliation. We still have many Indigenous communities that don't have clean water, where housing is in terrible shape. And we also need to make sure, by the way, I do know how to spell aggressively. Sorry for that error. We also need to make sure that even during the pandemic, that Indigenous organizations are properly funded to do the work. And the many, many, many wonderful, innovative Indigenous programs to reconnect people to their culture through the land. Why can't we support that kind of thing more? That would be important. Another is to completely retool the response to homelessness in Canada to focus more on prevention. As I said earlier, it's been a dirty word, but the government of Canada is now talking about prevention, and they mean it, right? I've had many conversations with them, and this is serious. And so this is what I showed you before about our current response to homelessness. What if we shifted it around like this? What if this became our goal, right? Where our investment is in prevention, so stopping the inflow, stopping evictions, helping families, helping women who are in difficult situations because of violence, helping youth so that they don't have to leave home, and then also help people get housing and support so they don't return to homelessness again. Now, this is new thinking in Canada, and one of the roles of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness is to develop the conceptual and knowledge and evidence base for a shift to prevention. So these are two documents that you can download for free if you're interested in finding out more. The first one is just about homelessness in general. How do we prevent it and what does the evidence say? The second one is a roadmap for prevention of youth homelessness that focuses specifically on youth. And we've done that work in partnership with Away Home Canada. The other thing is we have a Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab. It's a Networks of Centers of Excellence project. There's the purpose here is to design and test out preventive interventions for youth. And we are doing a number of demonstration projects across Canada right now, 12 different ones where we're designing the intervention, funding its application, and then doing evaluation outcomes and developmental evaluation so that we learn more about it and develop the evidence base. So that's where we're at now. I'm not sure how long I was supposed to talk, but there we go. So, so there.
Thank you, Dr. Gaetz. That was fantastic. I was very much looking forward to this talk in particular because I watch the news every night. I watch world news and I watch local news, and I see nothing about homelessness in the media. And I find that very distressing. I live in downtown Toronto.
Right.
I have a food bank at the top of my street. And yeah, I think this is such an important issue, and it's just, it's not being talked about enough, in my opinion. So we were supposed to wrap up about 12:45, so we have 5 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to extend that a little bit so we can get to some of these questions. Okay, first one is from Lee, who asks, can Dr. Gaetz repeat the great quote about giving away rights? I think that you quoted it from Osgood.
Okay, so in times of crisis, people are willing to exchange human rights for what they see as safety and protection. Usually, though, it's somebody else's rights, right? So and you can see that all over the place. That happens all the time. It's interesting with the Black Lives Matter and the protests happening in the US, which are largely peaceful, how it gets framed by some elements of the American government. I won't go any further. But yeah, I think it's a true thing that we have to be careful for. It doesn't mean it will always roll out that way, but I think we certainly saw that after 9/11, where it's like, yeah, it's fair to stop people who look like they're Middle Eastern on airplanes and this kind of thing, right? So like, that kind of stuff can be really, really, scary and slippery, and it results, in the context where we haven't addressed systemic racism, and that's the case in Canada. We have to be very careful in these kind of situations.
Thank you. Monica asks, Toronto's dealing with a very large encampment issue. What are your thoughts on tent cities and how to better serve people who are sleeping rough?
Well, as I said, I think people should have the right to not be in a shelter if they don't want to. Some of the encampments, there's different research on it. Eric Weissman has done some interesting research on them. Some of them lead to really interesting governing models and some positive things. They're still temporary housing. I think that if we were able to move to a place where we actually help people get into housing with supports they need and in ways that help them stay connected and overcome social exclusion, most people would take that up as a preference, right? But it's more of a symptom of what is going on than something that is a problem that we have to tackle, right? Like I'm against like clamping down and smashing up encampments and treating people like they're criminals. People are there because they have nowhere else to go. And they also want to feel safe. Like, one thing that you need to know is that the rates of criminal victimization amongst homeless people are exponentially greater than are for the general public. The reason being is that most of us have a door we can close and lock. Now, it doesn't mean violence doesn't happen in homes, but so, like, until we can like really put in our energy to prevent and end homelessness, like, I don't think we should be telling people that they can't sleep outside and that they have to go into a crowded shelter if that's what's available.
Thank you. That's actually a really good segue to the next question, which is from Vandell. Why exactly is homelessness policed? Which laws or policies should be removed or less stringently enforced?
There's the history of it goes back to the United States, where they started doing that with public ordinances to restrict people from panhandling or sleeping in parks. And so the response is complicated, right? So the criminalization of homelessness involves multiple things. It involves like creating new laws like the Safe Streets Act, which clearly was intended to target people experiencing homelessness. But it also means using existing laws to harass people. So giving people tickets for drinking in public. and it's pretty hard to drink in private when you don't have your own home. So, or jaywalking, or trespassing, or there's lots of laws already that can be used to like move people on, and that's what it basically does. But the other thing is we changed the design of things in Canada to make it difficult for people to be homeless and outside. Park benches often have armrests in the middle, right? That's not for your comfort. That's so people don't sleep on them. There was a time in Toronto where you'd have these heating vents embedded in sidewalks for high-rise buildings for the heat exchange. The city at one time spent money to move those to the street, like spent dollars to actually physically move them. And so the problem that underlies all this is it's a problem of policing, but it's also a problem of stigma in the public, that many people in the public think very negatively of people who are homeless, and a lot of myths persist that people want to be homeless. I get that all the time, or that people are lazy, or they just want to be on welfare. And in fact, if you're homeless, you're not likely on welfare. And so people do want to be housed. And the desires of people who are homeless are really conventional. They want what you want. They want what I want. They want a place to stay that's safe. They want enough food. They want to be respected. They want, good relationships, all those kind of things. But when the public sees them as a threat, and I'll give you a quote. Sorry for rambling on about this, but it's a big issue. When the Safe Streets Act was passed in Ontario in 2000, Jim Flaherty then was the Attorney General of the province of Ontario. And he said at that time, when people no longer feel safe walking down the street or driving in their cars, it's time for government to act. And that kind of sounds like a common sense thing, but it's actually a really dangerous statement in a context where we have widespread discrimination and racism. Can you imagine, if I, as a Canadian, am nervous about walking down the street because of the way someone looks, what they're wearing, where they're sitting, the color of their skin, it's not up to the government to appease my concerns about safety by arresting that person or ticketing them or moving them on. Like, that's not right? Like, that's so right for, problems in society, where we over police Black people, or where Black people get stopped driving cars way more often than people who aren't Black. It's a very dangerous way to think that if I'm concerned about safety, it's because that my fear is justified, when it's more about stigma and prejudice, right? So we have to get away from that and fight against that. Unfortunately, the Safe Streets Act is still in place in this province. We still use policing. Some communities are better than others, of course, but in the context where we're talking about the role of policing and defunding police, the question of to what degree police should be responsible for addressing homelessness is one that's as important as well, right? So we're talking about that in the context of mental health. We should also be talking about that in terms of policing. And there are communities, Calgary's an example, where the police services are saying, we're not good at this. Can we come up with something different? And so there's positive things out there, but we have to really stay away from criminalizing homelessness.
Thank you for that comprehensive response. It is a complicated issue, and it sounds like it might be a Scholars Hub lecture of its own. So I have another question from the audience. Tim asks, one of the worries of frontline outreach workers is that there are homeless folks applying for CERB that don't officially qualify and that they might be clawed back. In the same vein as basic outcome, is there any talk of waiving punitive measures for homeless folks who don't officially qualify for CERB?
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see what they do, because you can see that there'll be pressure on them. People are scamming, and especially when it's tied to people who are stigmatized already. Part of the challenge is that when they rolled out CERB, the government kind of signaled that, if you're not sure you qualify, don't worry, just apply for it.
Mm,
And you know, a lot of people, like, it's a new program, and so with the rollout of new programs, there's always these complexities. It'll be interesting, I think. You know, it would not look good for the government to start, you know, trying to get money from people who have none, right? And worsen the problems of people experiencing homelessness. So I don't know what will happen. I'm hopeful that they'll do the right thing. You know, like the cost of recovering that money, we've seen that with like the tickets that get handed out to people who are homeless, you know, that they obviously can't pay. Anything that increases the debt burden for people who are homeless is going to impact their ability to ever get housed, right? Because you have to have a decent credit rating, this kind of thing. So we'll see how that goes. There is no doubt that they're having conversations within government now about what to do about this. And hopefully their response so far has been pretty nimble and pretty supportive. And so I'm hopeful that they'll come up with something that's going to be good. But I do share your fear, right? Like, how horrible will that be if it's like, okay, now I owe $8,000 more and I'll never be able to pay that
yeah,
back. Like, they just keep people down.
yeah. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. I am aware of the time and that, you know, some of our audience members do have something else to get to. So I'm going to end things here. Dr. Gaetz, thank you so much. It's been enlightening and distressing, but I think it's important to draw attention to these issues, especially right now.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for showing up.
Thanks.
And thank you for the questions. Very good questions.
So before I say goodbye to you and our audience, I want to thank you again for taking the time to join us today. And I have one last poll for you. This question helps us inform our events moving forward and how we tailor them to you. The question is, would you recommend this event to a friend? And the poll should appear on your screen right now. Feel free to share today's talk with your friends. It will be posted to our York Alumni YouTube channel. You can also join our LinkedIn group or follow us on Facebook by searching York University Alumni. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at York Alumni. And feedback about this event or any of our programming is always welcome. We're reachable at alumni@yorku.ca. So thanks to the popularity of this series and all of you here today, and the feedback we've received from you, Scholars Hub at Home will continue through the summer every other Wednesday at 12 noon. We're kicking off the summer series on Wednesday, July 8th with a special panel discussion titled Economic Bailouts During COVID-19, How Will Industries Recover After the Shutdown? And it's going to feature thought leaders from the social sector, arts, and sports. We hope to see you all for that discussion. In the meantime, have a wonderful Canada Day holiday. Thank you for being here and continue to stay safe and well.